Open Doors, which is a great foundation, estimated that 388 million Christians live under some form of persecution. Massive problem of our age. And you're right, we don't have marches in the street for it. I think that you really just have to tip your hat to the Palestinian propaganda team, and that they have managed to sustain an incredibly popular narrative for generations. And they've been able to find a ton of backers within the Muslim world and sort of organize the global Islamic community to get behind them on this issue. But there is no similar coalition for the persecution of Christians.
Today, I'm joined by Samuel Ben-Ur, a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focusing on the Middle East and Christian persecution. Samuel has written extensively about Hamas and the future of Gaza, Iran, jihadism, and the growing persecution of Christians around the world. Before joining FDD, Samuel worked with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, the American Enterprise Institute, and an Israeli cybersecurity startup. He is also a graduate of Tufts University, where he founded the Tufts Tribune, a campus newspaper dedicated to free speech and politically balanced reporting. Samuel, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Now, Samuel, everybody's talking about a plan to finally disarm Hamas. Do you believe yourself that Hamas is going to voluntarily give up its weapons? Why would Hamas voluntarily surrender the very thing that gives it its power?
Yeah, so of course, Hamas will never willingly surrender its weapons. And a lot of the recent activity we've seen from the Board of Peace has been them trying to kind of skirt by that fact in different ways and different estimations. So the most recent 15-point plan that they just sent along to Israel and to Hamas basically says that Hamas will be disarmed in verifiable parcels of land. So in some of the parts that Hamas currently controls on their side of Gaza, that's now split by the yellow line, there will be areas where Hamas will give up weapons. Some committee of international verifiers will come in and verify that Hamas is disarmed, and then Israel will, I guess, pull out of that part of Gaza, which doesn't make a ton of sense, first of all, because Israel doesn't control the parts of Gaza where Hamas is active. That's kind of the whole point of the buffer zone and the yellow line. So it's unclear if it will be like Israel will pull out from a proportional area on their side of the yellow line. But regardless of what the technical part of this is, it means that Hamas is saying, we will disarm and Israel will not be the ones to disarm us, which is why Netanyahu and Israel, of course, rejected this deal. And that's why Kushner is flying back to Israel to try to negotiate something, because they don't trust Hamas, nor should they.
Now, so Israel is saying that Hamas has been trying to rebuild weapons production, drones, naval forces, their Nukba units. Does Hamas's behavior tell us more than anything that it signs at the negotiating table?
Absolutely. Over the course of the ceasefire should be in quotations, but since October, Israel has been conducting a series of airstrikes on Hamas that has been trying to rebuild its capabilities sort of across every facet of the organization. That means they've been striking factories where Hamas is trying to rearm money men who have been trying to fund this rearmament, and then operational commanders who have been continuing to plan attacks against Israeli soldiers, and then the other and civilians. And the other aspect that they've been targeting is recently the Shin Bet sort of publicly said that they were taking out terrorists who participated in October 7th personally. And those would be the only sort of airstrikes that are not directly linked to Hamas trying to reconstitute itself. But Israel's been very active, especially in recent months. That sort of died down since this deal has been announced. I think there are a lot of political considerations that we can talk more about as to why that is. But over the course of the past few months, Israel has been striking Hamas unit commanders, platoon commanders, financiers, sort of everybody. It's a little more than mowing the grass, to be honest. That's the level it's been at.
Now, what does Hamas disarmament actually mean? Meaning, if Hamas hands over thousands of rifles, but it retains their tunnels, explosives, commanders, weapons production capabilities, and the ability to recruit, then has Hamas really disarmed?
No, and that's why Israel insists on total disarmament, which means everything that you mentioned and anything else that they might have, and them getting out of government. But when the 15-point plan was first announced, there were a bit of inconsistencies with how the Board of Peace presented what disarmament meant. They were focused on terror infrastructure, tunnels, larger rockets, and some RPGs. They didn't say, they had a weird sort of other plan for Kalashnikovs, which is actually the weaponry that Hamas uses to maintain control within the Gaza Strip. They crushed a popular protest movement that was supposed to take place earlier in June, but instead Hamas got wind of it and they sent their armed guards with AK-47s to stand on the street and prevent this protest from happening. So Israel needs that to be in the deal, if there is to be a deal. And again, you should be skeptical if anyone tells you that they have like magically found a way to get a death cult that is willing to die for its cause to give up its weapons. But even if they sign this piece of paper, that was something that still needed to be ironed out. So they clarified afterwards that the deal does include small arms like AK-47s. But that wasn't in the original deal, I think because Israel insisted that it be included, but the original estimation, and this is mostly guesswork, but the Board of Peace knows that Hamas will never give up all of its arms. So they're trying to sort of justify their own existence as an organization by making this progress when really it's just running on a treadmill.
Who can possibly verify that Hamas has surrendered all of its weapons? We're talking about an organization that spent years constructing an enormous underground infrastructure. The current framework envisions international forces eventually helping stabilize Gaza, but who's actually going to confront Hamas if Hamas refuses to cooperate?
So there are two different answers to that question. The first on who will verify the disarmament. The Board of Peace announced in the statement that an international verification committee would be constituted, and they would be the ones to go into the parts of Gaza that Hamas controls and verify that that Hamas has given up their weapons. It is unclear who exactly will be a part of that. It's clearly not the ISF or the International Stabilization Force, which is, a different part of this equation. So it will likely be made up of, maybe diplomats or politicians from the Board of Peace countries. Now, there are a couple things. And first, I want to just point this out. Hamas actually agreed to this deal. They have, Israel hasn't. And that should give anyone who has been interested in this issue for a little bit massive cause for concern. It's that why is Hamas okay with even putting this down on paper? Because it says that they're willing to disarm. And I think that the reason is because on the Board of Peace are Hamas's main backers, Turkey and Qatar. Not Iran, obviously, but Turkey and Qatar would possibly be on this verification committee. And I think Hamas sees this sort of deal as its best chance for survival, where Israel is not the one who's verifying the disarmament. They have to take the word of countries on the Board of Peace, right? So if it is somehow, and this would have to be negotiated, and there's always the losses that the U.S. has taken on the negotiating table to Middle Eastern countries over the years, with Iran being the most recent example. But if Turkey and Qatar can get their way onto this verification committee, Hamas thinks that they can hide in plain sight well enough under this model to survive as an organization and hold true power in Gaza. Now, in terms of who would be doing the disarmament, no one would be. Hamas would be voluntarily disarming, which is on its face just a little bit ridiculous, because the whole point of this is to sidestep what I think, at least I've been saying and many other people have been saying since the start of this ceasefire. The only way this ends is Israel going in to the remaining 30% of the Gaza Strip and disarming Hamas. And there are different ways that can happen, including ways that stretch out over a longer period of time, but have fewer civilian casualties. But ultimately, that's what has to happen if Hamas is to be disarmed, because they will not give up their weapons willingly. And I wouldn't trust a verification committee if it has anyone, basically besides only the US or Israeli officials on it.
Could we end up recreating the exact mistake that followed Israel's 2005 withdrawal? Hamas rebuilding while the world convinces itself that, the problem has been solved?
I think that if this current deal goes through as is, that's likely. Hamas is already rebuilding. And now, because this deal was announced, Israel has decelerated the pace of strikes that it was doing on the terror group. It's not clear how effective those were in actually preventing their disarmament. But you'd have to think that Hamas has so little ability to produce weapons internally after 3 years of war in Israel, taking out probably almost all of their production centers. You would have to think that it was working. If this really does give them a pause to rebuild and disarm, and they have a timeline over the course of, 5 years or something like that to rebuild, they're going to find a way to do it. They have clandestine methods to get arms shipments and materials into the country. There was one where Hamas sympathizers or members in Egypt would send crates of rocket fuel in boxes down the coast of Egypt to Gaza and they would just pick it up off of the beaches. I don't know how effective that is at scale, but the point is they're going to try to rearm during this. They will try to survive as the true power in Gaza. And there is no piece of paper in the world that will change that fact or prevent them from trying to do this.
Now, how much of Hamas's military infrastructure actually remains today? Is there any way of verifying that accurately?
There isn't a good database or count. It's not like they ever publicize this information. There are a few things that we do know. One is that they haven't launched a rocket, I think, in a year, maybe more. So you can assume that that capability is firmly off the table. Israel will talk about sometimes, especially in the recent strikes, that it hit a silo that contained rockets, right? But earlier in the ceasefire, it would sometimes say that they're conducting strikes to prevent a rocket launch. And they haven't said that in months either, which sort of leads you to believe that even if Hamas does have a couple dozen, maybe even 100 rockets, they don't have launchers for them. So you can sort of say that that capability is off the table because Lord knows they would have tried to launch a rocket at Israel at any point in time just to remind people that they exist. Right, that's the point. They're more statements because they never hit anything. The tunnel system is the real big infrastructural concern. And the numbers, even after 3 years of war, are sort of abysmal, at least from what Israel has released publicly. They say that about 50% of the total tunnels that they know about have been destroyed or filled with cement on some way or another. And most of that is happening on the Israeli-controlled side of the yellow line. So that's the area they control. They haven't even finished destroying all of the tunnels there. There are also parts of Gaza, like the central camps, that Israel has never gone into. Throughout the course of this war, they've never been there. And whenever Israel goes into one of these areas, at least this has been the pattern, they've discovered miles of tunnels that they didn't know existed before. That is going to be the big terror infrastructure problem because they're below ground, hard to destroy, not hard to rebuild, honestly, because you just need civilian excavation equipment to do that. And that's not something that Israel, is going to go around bombing en masse necessarily. So that's the real thing to look out for. Everything else can be done sort of above ground and verifiably, but not that. And completing this part of the disarmament will require probably a prolonged effort by Israel.
Can you realistically create a Palestinian government in Gaza that is independent of Hamas? Can't Hamas just infiltrate this new Palestinian government institutions from within and you'll have Hamas basically under a different name?
They'll certainly try. It's unclear. It seems as if the NCAG, which is the body based in Egypt right now, led by Ali Shaf, which is meant to be Palestinian technocrats, has not yet been infiltrated by Hamas. And the way that I can say that is because Israel has said that they're hypothetically okay with them running the strip. And I think Israel would know better than any other group besides Hamas if the NCAG people were Hamas members. They will undoubtedly, at every level, try to infiltrate in new institutions within Gaza. They've done this even with international organizations that have come into Gaza, like UNRWA, for example, or, Al Jazeera is not international, but it's not a, Gaza-based media reporting, but they have Hamas operatives in their midst. Anything that tries to operate within Hamas-controlled Gaza will always face the threat of Hamas infiltration. The one thing that the Board of Peace has done that I think might actually help alleviate this concern is a different program that they announced called Pilot Zones, which is essentially a rebuilt settlement, mostly funded by the UAE, at least the first one, where vetted Palestinian civilians who, one, have no weapons, two, are found by a to-be-specified mechanism to not have Hamas affiliation, would go and live on the Israeli-controlled side of the yellow line. And there would be small pockets that are administered to by the NCAG. So at that point, you can't stop some Hamas members from getting into these new areas. Whatever you do, there will be people who are like Hamas ideologues or will join Hamas even if they haven't joined in yet. What you can do is make sure that weapons don't get into these new areas. And I think starting fresh in this way is sort of the most innovative and likely to be successful way than anything beyond, another 3 years of the IDF in Gaza disarming, door to door.
Now, we constantly hear that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. How much support does Hamas actually have among Palestinians today? Is there any way of verifying that information?
There are always some polls being run either by Palestinian bodies or by international groups. Most of them put it at around 50% and have that number, relatively stable even throughout the war. You can't trust any of these things, not because the organizations doing them are malignant, but just because there's such a culture of fear in Gaza that even if you take an anonymous survey, Hamas will find out and, knock on your door and drag you into the street and shoot you, which is what they do to anyone who opposes them publicly. So it's really difficult to know. One way you could sort of find this out is if you do the program that I just talked about, the pilot zone thing, because then people could signal their disapproval with Hamas by leaving the Hamas-controlled part of Gaza and going to the Israeli-controlled side. I don't know how many people would do that. I don't know how many Gazans are okay with living under Hamas rule in like a destroyed enclave from a war that Hamas brought upon them. A rational situation would mean that most everyone in Gaza despises Hamas, but it's not a rational place at all. So I wouldn't be surprised if they still had strong support.
Do you think Gaza can be de-radicalized? Meaning, would you think they'll be able to rebuild its culture and educational system and get rid of that ideology that caused October 7th?
In theoretical terms, it's possible. And, Japan and Germany were de-radicalized in the, aftermath of World War II, Japan being the most ideologically committed out of those and like their entire population. I mean, you go to Imperial Japan in World War II, that's what it looks like when Hamas runs a country, essentially. And over a generation, they were de-radicalized. So it's possible. I don't think it's likely that that's going to happen because there would need to be such a strong outside. I mean, the reason that Japan and Germany were able to be de-radicalized is because the US occupied those countries until such a point where they could leave and feel that the population wouldn't just resume the war immediately. I don't know who would be doing that. In this case, there is some precedent. The UAE has been very good about de-radicalizing its population, who, of course, had a similar flavor of radicalization in their society, but not nearly to the same extent. Saudi Arabia also maybe, and that they would want to get in on any project that involves Gaza as well. So there is precedent for de-Islamicization or de-radical Islamicization of a society, even within the region, but that would involve a prolonged occupation by some force to be able to institute that, over the course of a generation, more even.
Now, I want to move on to Iran. What happens today in Iran if a Muslim decides to become a Christian? Is Christianity actually growing inside the Islamic Republic? And if it is, why does that frighten the regime so much?
So, 3 different questions. The first one I want to answer is that Iran has one of the fastest growing Christian populations in the world at the current moment. That's by rate. There are approximately 1 million Christians living in Iran. The actual number is likely larger, but these are just what people have found off of anonymous surveys. The reason that so many of them are converting to Christianity is it's especially like a young, educated crowd who is doing this. And the reason is they're so disillusioned with this regime that defines itself so rigidly to Islam that they're seeking something else. And there's, you could say all of the truisms about Christianity thriving in oppression and where things are darkest, and that certainly has borne out over history. But I think people have defined the regime and their loathing of it with Islam. So not only is there a growth in Christianity, but there's also a massive deceleration of Islamic faith within the country. I mean, secularization of the young Iranian population. There were reports coming out during the bombing that people wouldn't even hide in mosques because they didn't want to go into them or be associated with that. So, the regime defines itself as an Islamic regime, or Islamic Republic, whatever you want to call it. And people who hate the regime will transfer that over to Islam. Now, what happens if you are found to be a Christian? If you're found to be a Christian convert, so someone who is born Muslim but converted to Christianity, you're labeled an apostate under Iran's judicial system, which is based on Sharia. And you are likely arrested, and under the law, it's permissible for you to be executed for this offense. Iran is, of course, because of the things I just described, because the growth of Christianity within Iran is related to despising the regime. That's one of the reasons that they are extremely concerned about this. And over the course of the past 2 sort of large ceasefires, one after the 12-day war and the current one, they've used both as an opportunity to crack down on Christian converts, along with the rest of the population who they see as speaking out against their rule or protesting in some way.
Now, you've written about Iran using increasingly sophisticated surveillance capabilities. Can somebody essentially be tracked for practicing the wrong religion And how much of that surveillance technology has come from China?
Quite a bit of it. Iran definitely does not have a robust domestic surveillance infrastructure. It had to import most of it from China. My colleagues, Brad Bowman, Elaine Dzensky, and Mark Montgomery write about this in Axis of Aggressors, which just came out. But Iran basically imported a light version of China's incredibly sophisticated domestic surveillance system. There were, the ones we can verify are Tiandi, which is a Chinese video surveillance company that supplied Iran with many of the cameras it used to crack down and kill protesters during the women life freedom movements. And these cameras, along with some software companies that China also has and has connected with Iranians, have AI facial recognition, audio recording as well that they can put into house churches and surveil people there. So it's not nearly as robust as China just because Iran is sort of poor and not technologically advanced generally, but some of their surveillance system has been upgraded with really the highest end stuff on the market, and it comes straight from China.
Now, you've studied religious persecution around the world. What do you think, in your opinion, is the most dangerous country on earth today simply to be a Christian?
Without a doubt, it's North Korea. They have about 400,000 Christians, and that's based on really hard to verify surveys because it's such a closed society. But even though, the North Korean state constitution says that we're a socialist country, but we, freedom for all religions. Of course, that's total bunk. If you're found to own a Bible in North Korea, there's precedent for 3 generations of your family being sent to a labor camp and, essentially killed. You'll never get out of there. They kill people in there all the time, and it's impossible to verify this because we have no way sort of into this society. So they see Christianity as an anti-state crime, just believing in it, along with most other religions, but there aren't really other religions that are or were ever prominent within North Korea. So the penalties for it, it's the most oppressive regime in the world, I would say, the most totalitarian. And they see, of course, being Christian as a crime against Kim Jong-un and the Kim regime. So that is definitely the worst. And then there are others who compete for that title, especially China and Iran.
Now, you made an argument that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea aren't simply persecuting Christians independently. They're actually learning from and assisting one another. What does that cooperation look like?
So the best way to describe it is it's a trickle down from China and Russia to Iran and North Korea. The binding thing in this case is every single one of these countries is authoritarian, and religion in general that the state can't co-opt, like Islam in Iran or specifically Russian Orthodox Christianity in Russia, which is an extremely corrupt institution where the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, is like a longtime friend of Putin, takes marching orders from him. I even went to North Korea and blessed North Korea's only Russian Orthodox Church, which is purely for show. It has no standing congregation. It's just a show to foreign dignitaries for propaganda purposes. But they're deeply entwined in sort of this mythology. But the thing that unifies these countries is that there must be no institution within their societies that places something above the state. Right? It's common to authoritarianism. It's why America, which grew out of Judeo-Christian values, is the least authoritarian country, conceived of in the history of civilization. And it's because there's this idea that nobody is above God, right? It's fundamental. And that being born with this theology gives you unalienable rights as it is, because man was created in the image of God. Therefore, it's immoral for a government to rob man of those rights. That is the most anti-authoritarian idea for a state to believe. And it's why in authoritarian societies, like before we just were talking about, they're all united in the belief that Christianity is dangerous to them because it's not a religion that they can tolerate being controlled. The obvious outlier here would be Iran, but the difference is Iran derives its legitimacy by being the only voice of Islam. So they've essentially conflated, even more so than the cult of personalities of Kim in North Korea and, Mao and now Xi in China, but they've conflated the state with God in a way that allows them to merge one religion, which is the state religion, with their authoritarian system. But obviously you can't have a different religion outside of that because then that challenges, the legitimacy of the state. So anyway, that's why they do it. How they do it is complex, and there are many different relationships. One that you can broadly define for all of these is that China has given all of these countries domestic surveillance technology. North Korea, Russia, and Iran have all received tremendous amounts of Chinese technology that they use to surveil, all portions of their populations, but also Christians in all of these countries use it for these reasons. And there are some other relationships that are worth mentioning. China and North Korea as well have a very strong history because they have similar conceptions on how to deal with Christianity, although China is less austere about it than North Korea is. But something to note is that oftentimes North Korean Christians will try to escape North Korea. And one of the places that they try to escape to is China, because that border is slightly less well guarded than the DMZ in South Korea. So it's easier for them to go up there. When China finds these refugees at the request of the North Korean government and often sends them back to face, labor camp, 3 generations of your family going there with you. So that's another really, I think, terrible example of this cooperation. There's one more I want to highlight, which is Russia and Iran, which are the two closest in terms of both of them espoused to be the spokesperson of a religion, right? In Russia, it's Russian Orthodox Christianity. In Iran, it's Islam. They came together to host a theological summit with Patriarch Kirill, who I mentioned before is the head of the RSC, and the IRGC, not the IRGC, but Iran's mullahs. They've come together, I think, over a dozen times in the last 2 decades to create a framework to, on the international stage, destroy universal human rights. And they call it traditional values. The basic formulation of it is that our religions share a universal set of traditional values, and we should be implementing those instead of universal human rights because our state formulations of religion are correct. Now, this doesn't make sense for Islam, like hard line fundamentalist Islam and Russian Orthodox Christianity to come together to do this. But the reason they're able to is because traditional values don't actually have a definition, right? Universal human rights do have a definition, and it's that anyone should be free to practice whatever religion they see fit. That's the formulation on religious freedom in that system. But traditional values is whatever the state says is traditional is traditional. Right. So Russia says they have a whole system of what traditional religions are. And in Christianity, it's Russian Orthodox Christianity. It's just Russian Orthodox Christianity, and they are okay with Judaism. Right. And then Iran can have a total different conception of what traditional values are. And they can say our traditional values are making women wear hijabs, and if they don't, we'll flog them. Right. So it can play out differently and work within each of these authoritarian systems. And it's basically just carte blanche for these governments to justify whatever repressive activities they're doing to their own populations. So they haven't been successful in exporting this to the international community, obviously, because it's a terrible idea, but they are collaborating on this. And it is for this reason to suppress religious freedom and free Christian worship.
Millions of people across America and Europe have marched over Gaza and, what's happening to Palestinians. Where are the marches for Christians being slaughtered in, let's say, Sudan and Nigeria? Why does one conflict dominate universities, celebrities, social media, and international institutions, while another can remain almost invisible?
That's a great question. It's very hard for there to be one answer because the scale of persecution against Christians is just titanic. Open Doors, which is a great foundation, estimated that 388 million Christians live under some form of persecution. Many of those are in China. And, if you're in China, you probably, in most cases, will not be killed. So it's different levels of persecution, but it's still a massive, the religious freedom problem of our age. And you're right, we don't have marches in the street for it. The Trump administration has been sort of the first American administration to single this out as a religious freedom foreign policy issue, which I think no previous US president has done, even though this problem has existed for, since Christianity came into being, right? So very, very early on and before America. I think that you really just have to tip your hat to the Palestinian propaganda team in that they have managed to sustain an incredibly popular and for many compelling narrative for generations. And they've been able to find a ton of backers within the Muslim world and sort of organize the global Islamic community to get behind them on this issue. I think that has a tremendous amount of power because their community in this sense is built around this one issue. So it's the defining thing. But there is no similar coalition for the persecution of Christians.
Now, there's another contradiction I want to explore. Israel is routinely accused of being hostile towards Christians. How does the treatment of Christians in Israel compare with the treatment of Christians elsewhere in the Middle East? And do you think that criticism of Israel is sometimes disconnected from the broader reality facing religious minorities throughout the region?
Yeah, it's a totally hypocritical discussion, as you said. I do want to say there are incidents of, discrimination and sometimes even violence against Christians in Israel. This isn't excusing it. It's at a very low level. The government will make arrests in these cases, especially and this shouldn't be the case. They should be more proactive about it. But in the cases that receive international attention, most definitely. I would say that the difference that we look for, at least when we're deciding how to define when there's a Christian persecution problem within a country, is one, is the government causing the problem, right? Or is it trying to prevent it, which is a big case because, here in America, there are cases of people shooting up churches every week or so. Something that, there's a ton of anti-Christian violence in America, but how does the government respond to that? Right. And we respond to it by, tracking down these people and either, shooting them at the scene if they have a gun or arresting them and throwing them in prison for the rest of their lives. And that means that even though there are people in America who hate Christians and will persecute them, America is not, a country that conducts Christian persecution. Israel is the same way, and they have much less violence. I mean, nobody's been killed for being a Christian in Israel, as far as I can remember. I'm sure there are some cases in Europe, but certainly not in the last, 15, 20 years. That just hasn't been the case. What has been the case is there are a lot of spitting events, like people spitting at clergy and at monastery doors. There was that awful video earlier in the year of a guy kicking a nun just in the middle of the street in broad daylight. They arrested that guy and he's facing charges, on religiously. I don't know what the exact Israeli law is, but they have a, hate crime equivalent designation that they're charging him with. That's what you want to see. You want to see Israel do that more. And you especially want to see people like Ben Gvir not be saying something to along the lines of spitting is an ancient Jewish custom and it shouldn't be a crime, which is what he said both in 2017 and in 2023. That definitely does not help things. And it's worrying that he's in charge of the police. So we'll see how elections go. That's certainly problematic. But you can't say Israel as a state isn't committed to religious freedom and protecting Christians when it is, far and away the safest place in the Middle East for Christians to live. And there are a couple of examples that, people talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza all the time. Turkey used to be 20% Christian, right back when Ataturk was running things, in the early to mid 1900s. It was a 20% Christian country. They had one of the largest and most historical Greek Orthodox populations in the world because, of course, the Byzantine Empire originated in, modern day Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. It was the heart of Greek Christianity. Today, it's less than 1%. And that's because of a series of coercive, mostly administrative policies that Erdogan and his predecessors had instituted that have driven out Greek Orthodoxy from the country and made Turkey almost a 100% Muslim country. And then there are, Qatar, who I also should mention. They have actually quite a few Christians, and besides Israel, are the fastest growing Christian population in the Middle East. It's not because they say, we want more religious diversity. It's because the pseudo slave laborers that they bring in to do, infrastructure projects and for jobs are almost all from Christian countries. There are approximately 400,000, I want to say 400,000 to 600,000 Christians in Qatar. They have 6 churches in the entire country to worship at, and they're all located within one complex in Doha. And if they're found to be preaching or proselytizing, which is something that a lot of Muslim countries in the Middle East really come down on quite hard, yet Egypt included in this, even though we sometimes see them as an ally. But if you're found, you'll be deported or thrown in jail in Qatar. So Christians are allowed to proselytize in Israel. They have free access to their religious sites. They administer many of them. The population is growing. And really outside of these, I think the Rossing Center did a study on this and found 155 of these incidents of spitting and intimidation. Outside of this, there are very few religious freedom problems on this front in Israel.
Samuel, I want to thank you for your time. Really appreciate your expertise on these different topics that we spoke about. How can people find you and read your articles?
Thank you. Yeah, you can read my work on FDD's website. Just type in my name and all of my publications will come up. I also have a column in Providence Magazine. So if you want to check me out there, and then I'm on Twitter at Real Samuel Ben.
Okay. Thank you very much, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you.